Okay, and you heard that okay?
Yep.
Okay, good. Hello again, everybody. I hope you liked our first presentation this morning. Our second presentation today is going to be Alan Miller. Alan Miller is a Milwaukee Road boomer. Alan was smitten with an interest in trains at an early age. His favorite railroad, the Milwaukee Road, ran through his hometown of Duvall, Washington. Alan is a railroad boomer. Boomers travel for work from place to place and job to job, on the move, always looking forward to the next experience. His railroad career began at age 19 on the Rock Island in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. Next, Alan worked for Burlington Northern at Everett, Skykomish, and Lester, Washington. Alan hired on with the Milwaukee Road in September 1971. He started at Kittitas and ended at Kent when the Milwaukee Road shut down in the spring of 1980. During those 9 years, Alan worked at every station in operation on the Milwaukee Road. Coast Division. He worked at Port Angeles. Alan is a preeminent expert on the Milwaukee Road's Coast Division, both through his personal experiences and his exhaustive research. Alan is a Clint Eastwood fan. Married for 54 years, Alan has 3 children and 7 grandchildren. He lives in Darrington, Washington. Today, Alan will be talking about his personal experiences working for the Milwaukee Road in Port Angeles in the early 1970s. We'll take a look at some vintage images by John Ehlman along the way. So welcome, Alan. Why don't you go ahead and make my day?
Thank you,
How was
Jonathan.
that for an introduction? Okay, let me get my screen share going here. And there we go. Here we go. Can you see that okay?
Yep.
Great. Well, Alan, before we get started talking about your career out on the Olympic Peninsula, why don't you just tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got interested in railroading and how it was that you ended up in Port Angeles?
Well, as you said, I grew up in the town of Duval, and that was on the Milwaukee Road's Everett branch. So about 14 years of age, I started hanging out down by the railroad tracks and watching the local come through town, and that spurred my interest. And I wrote to some of the railroad officials, and the agent at Everett actually came to Duval and took me to Everett and gave me a tour of all the shippers and stuff. And I ended up getting a cab ride in the Everett local from Everett to Duval to return home that night. And so once I was of age, I hired out on the railroad and was going to make that my career. But unfortunately, the Milwaukee Road train pulled out from the station without me and left me in the dust.
So here we have, there we go. Here we have the young Alan Miller. Tell us about where you are and what you're doing in these pictures.
Okay, on the left-hand side, I'm working at Kent Washington Depot, and it was in the process of copying Burlington Northern train orders, which we had to copy for the Bellingham trains that went through Kent and then got on to the BN at Renton. And a rail fan showed up at the depot that day, and so he snapped a couple pictures of me at work, and then was kind enough to print them out and mail them to me later. And then the picture on the right is several years earlier. I worked for about a year as the operator at Everett Washington Depot. And I'm in my little office there pounding out some reports on the teletype machine.
Well, tell us a little bit about this teletype machine. We don't see those around the office too much anymore.
No, but when I worked at the railroad, these were common in every major depot. And what it was is you typed out your information, and it came out on a piece of tape, almost like a ticker tape, and it would punch various combinations of 5 lines of little holes, and those holes would correspond to the letters on the keyboard that you were punching. And then when the tape was completely done, then you stuck it through another part of the machine and did a couple of things to get it going. And then as this tape fed through the machine, it would type out a list or a report or even just a plain old message and send it out to points all along the Milwaukee Road.
Interesting.
We,
So
we
we're
had
going to be
to,
taking a look today at your time out at the Olympic Peninsula, and let's start out in beautiful Elliott Bay.
yeah, I heard about this accident, but I never uh, uh, knew much more about it until this article came out here um, showing the
Yeah, in
cars
this case,
actually
what
floating
happened
out
was
there.
a freighter pulling into Elliott Bay hit the Milwaukee car barge and sank it. And,
Yeah,
and fortunately, they were able to rescue the crew off the barge, but the following day, these boxcars full of lumber were still floating. Picture from the Seattle PI, I think that would be January 1st, 1950.
well, um, the former agent at Port Angeles, Eddie Manuel, he used to tell a story about a Navy ship that was making its way through Puget Sound in the fog, and they had a lookout on the deck looking through the fog with binoculars, and he hollered to the captain that there was something ahead of him. And the captain asked what it was, and he says, "You ain't gonna believe this. I think it's a Milwaukee Road freight train." And it was a barge that he spotted with all the railroad cars on it.
So here's a list of some of the people that were on that barge that got rescued. There's some people that worked and been in this business for quite some time. There's some interesting folks here, aren't there, Alan?
Yeah, you'll see that some of these dates go back to 1909, which is when Milwaukee started barge service, and they contracted out to somebody to handle these barges originally. And then I think about 1913, they built their own tug, the Milwaukee, and started handling everything on their own.
So that's why we start seeing captains showing up in 1913 and
Yes.
so on. So yeah, it's kind of interesting looking back at some of these folks. And then here's one of your artworks. Do you remember this?
Yeah, I actually have no recollection of this drawing until it popped up again. But it must have been a real event. They must have sunk a car or at least water damaged it on the trying to load it onto the barge, because otherwise I don't know why I would put it as a southern boxcar with that number on it.
Right.
But I was in the habit in those days of drawing cartoons when anything unusual happened and then giving it to the crew.
Yeah. Well, we'll learn more about this unfortunate incident in another episode. So, but it is sort of it is kind of an interesting cartoon. You are quite a good drawer, by the way. So here's a map of what we're going to be looking at today. You can see the railroad runs from Port Townsend to Port Angeles, and it's what's the difference at Discovery Junction between the two lines? What's going on there?
Oh, well, that's because the line from Discovery Junction to Port Townsend and also south to Quilcene was owned by the Port Townsend Railroad.
Okay, so it was a different railroad, but the Milwaukee Road used it?
Yeah, the Milwaukee had trackage rights over it to get to their barge landing in Port Townsend. And the Port Townsend Railroad got revenue for all of the Milwaukee Road cars that travel over their line. And so in Port Angeles, when we waybuilt the cars out, we had to pre-stamp them with a Port Townsend Railroad stamp at Discovery Junction so that they would get their revenue.
Okay. And the Milwaukee tried to deal with that, as we'll see a little bit later on. So here we are down on Pier 27, March 1st, 1978, and we can see a Milwaukee Road switch engine is loading the barge in Elliott Bay. So, and then,
Yeah,
yeah,
I never got down to Seattle to watch barge operations down there loading them, but I probably should have just for my own satisfying my curiosity, but this one at Seattle was a 3-track ramp, as was the one over in Port Townsend, so that they could work 3 tracks at a time without having to shift the barge around.
And then they use those flat cars to be able, as like a handle, to be able to reach the cars on the barge so that they don't actually have to put the locomotive on the barge.
Yeah, that was so that they didn't have to run that heavy locomotive over the apron any more than they absolutely had to.
Absolutely had to, yeah. I mean, 1978, it's possible Frank Zellerhoff could be in this picture because
Probably, yeah.
he was in charge of loading the barges back then. So here we are in 1980, and things are a little more run down. This is actually after the Seattle and North Coast took over from the Milwaukee Road when the Milwaukee Road shut down.
Yeah.
So
Same
when was that? That was
location.
about March 1980. How did that Milwaukee Road shut down? I mean, what happened? I mean,
Well, they went bankrupt in 1977 and they uh, stretched it out as long as they possibly could. There was efforts to try and save the West End. In fact, most of us employees were willing to put our severance into the company and become employee owned, but the judges in the bankruptcy hearings kiboshed that. And then we had a governor here in Washington that favored Burlington Northern and uh, wouldn't hear of any Milwaukee Road takeover by employees. So the whole thing pretty much fell apart.
so you ended up, while you were working for the Milwaukee, before, the end of the railroad, you were working in Port Angeles.
Yeah, yeah. I worked what we called the extra board, where I didn't have a permanent location. I just worked from place to place wherever they needed relief, somebody on vacation or taking personal time off. I'd go in and relieve them. And I stayed busy. I was busy all the time. In fact, I was busier than sometimes in a regular job because sometimes I wouldn't get days off. I'd go right from one job the next day to the next one. But in 1973, they had a uh, opening coming up at Port Angeles for a couple of weeks for Johnny Samwald, who was the regular agent here. Used to go on a annual hunting trip in the fall. So they asked me if I'd come over here and relieve. So I did come over here and do this for 2 weeks. And then the following year, I came over and did it again for 2 weeks. And then the next year, I was on a permanent job in Kent. I'd been forced to, they eliminated the extra board and I was forced to take a permanent job. But they called me up anyway and asked me if I would come over here and relieve. So I did. But by that time, the Milwaukee Road had purchased the Port Townsend Railroad and was trying to do everything with just a local crew. And this job kind of turned into a nightmare where you were stuck here basically 24 hours a day until the local got back into town. And so my third term here was so miserable that after that I just turned them down. I told them I didn't want to come back here and work anymore.
So here's what the inside of the depot looks like now. Who all sat where and how did this kind of change over the years?
Well, the windows there at the very bottom of the drawing is where my desk was. I had a desk there that I operated out of. Um,
Can you
I
see my cursor
recall,
okay when I kind of wave it around down there?
yeah,
Okay,
that's the
all right,
spot right
keep
there.
going.
And then that entrance door there where it says platform, those ones had been converted into a window. This originally was the way into the freight room.
Oh,
And then there was a depot scale built into the floor there. And what they did is they replaced those swinging doors with windows, and they enclosed some of that office with glass, and that became the chief dispatcher's office for when they when this was its own division over here. And but what I recall is that this other door here below that, where it says platform here, yeah, right there. That was the main entrance door to get into the depot when I worked there. And as I recall it, from that lower part of the door, there was a wall there. So this was like a hallway that went back to where the chimney was. And then there was a door that went into the office here where I worked. And then over on the far right of the office, right in there somewhere, they had added on to this building. It was built as an L shape, but they squared it off by adding onto that space there. And so there was a clerk that also worked in the depot, and she had a desk that was in that area there where they put the new addition on.
So how many people worked at the Port Angeles Depot when you were there as the relief agent for
There
Charlie
was
Sandball?
there was three of us that shared that building. There was me, the agent, and then Gene Hannafy, the clerk, and then over where the chief dispatcher's office had been was now the section foreman's office, and his name was Arnie Westerfield.
Wow, okay. So we're going to talk a little bit about operating trains. Now, here's a timetable from 1953. So explain to us what timetables do, and then we'll look at what timetables don't do next.
Okay, well, the timetable is basically the authority for scheduled trains to occupy the track. They have times there on the left side is westward trains, and you read from top to bottom is how that reads your time. So the train 95 is authorized to depart Port Townsend at 9:05 a.m. He's not allowed to leave before that time. He can leave later than that time, but that's his authority for being on the track is those times. And then over on the other side of train 96, you start at the bottom of the page and you read up on for eastbound trains.
Okay. And then there was offices in Port Angeles and Port Townsend. And in 1953, there was still an office in Squim.
Yeah, I believe Squim was open till about 1967 or so. And yeah, it gives you the office hours there. And
And that letter W, now, what is that letter W for? See, under Rule 6A?
letter W is water. And the um let's see some of the other ones there. I'm a bit rusty. I don't remember all of them now, but
No, I don't remember them
I think
all
the
either. The only
Z,
reason I mentioned the W is because there's a water tank there, as we'll see, because in the steam days, that's where they needed to water the locomotive.
right.
Right. Well, now, okay, so we've looked at what timetables do. Now, here's how we do things that are not in the timetable. Explain this one to us.
Yeah, by this late date, the Milwaukee had just eliminated the schedules in the timetable and just ran all the trains as an extra train, which is a train that doesn't have an authorized schedule. And in this one, they put the local out as a work extra and just gave him working hours and limits between Port Angeles and Port Townsend.
So in this case, engine 533 can leave at 11:01 p.m. and can work until 3:01 p.m. between PA and PT.
Right. Yeah, and
Okay.
that would be actually 3:01 p.m. the following day.
Following day.
To be
Okay, so
proper,
that'd be
it
November
probably should say
2nd,
it till 3:01
1974.
p.m. November 2nd, but that's
So,
the way they put them out.
so then I'm looking at the bottom here and it says Miller. I'm assuming that's you.
Yeah, that's me.
Okay, and then who's MTS above it?
MTS is Maury T. Sevich, who was our division superintendent, and he was the authority for these train orders. So a train dispatcher would put the order out, but it was under the superintendent's authority that they were issued.
Got it. Now, there's a bunch of information going on here at once, folks, but Alan, just quickly tell us what's all going on here.
Well, the local on this order is actually has two units, and one of the units is going onto the barge to go over to Tacoma, probably for either some heavy repairs or monthly uh, service that can only be done at the main shops. And so they're going to load one of the engines on the barge. So that means that the uh, train will be coming back with a different numbered locomotive. So this order covers both movements for the 545 to run from Port Angeles to Port Townsend, but to come back as the 502.
Okay, because the 545 then is going to Tacoma. And then what's Johnny Sandwall talking about over here on the right? Looks like there's a bunch going on.
Yeah, this was the nightly message that went with the train orders to the crew, and it basically outlines any unusual things going on. It also lists where uh, cars are to be picked up or set out en route.
Like in this case at Tukey's.
Yeah, and
Okay.
then if anything goes wrong, it has a number of phone numbers down there. You can get a hold of the train dispatcher, or you can get a hold of the agent.
Yeah, all the phone numbers there, isn't that something? So let's take a little bit of a tour of the railroad. We'll start out with the John Illman photo from 1953. This is right at the end of the steam era.
Wow.
Yeah, isn't that something? You know, John Illman lived in Nordland, which is on Marrowstone Island. So he was actually local to Jefferson County, and as we'll see, that having home field advantage served him well. So let's just take a minute though and come back and talk about the Port Townsend Southern and explain to us just quickly who the Fox family was and how that change occurred and what was the consequence for the operations.
Well, the Fox family owned the railroad. I'm not up to speed on when they actually took purchase of it, but I think they'd owned it for a couple decades at least, I think. And the Port Townsend switch engine was actually built for, I think, Ohio Public Service or something. And John Fox needed a new locomotive for his railroad, and he used some kind of leverage to get that locomotive diverted to his railroad instead of going to Ohio Power. And so it was a little Baldwin center cab switcher that they used for loading and unloading the barges at Port Townsend.
So here's a picture from 1944. Who are all these guys?
Well, this is the train crew for the local freight at that time. And from left to right, you got conductor Paul Heald, and then Butch Helwick, the fireman, who later became engineer on the line. Howard Hillman, brakeman in the middle there. And then Oral Freeman, engineer. He was the son of Edwin Freeman, who was like the #1 engineer on the seniority list over there when the line first started. And then Johnny Jacobson was the brakeman.
Here we're going to take a kind of a tour of the railroad looking at some of the John Illman photographs. John had the opportunity to take a few pictures of one of the last steam trains, probably July of 1953, right? I mean, diesels were right around the corner. And beautiful day. And look at this. He gets this great picture at Discovery Junction because the crew is at Beans because there was a place there people like to stop and eat.
Yeah.
Didn't
They,
they
they,
have like a signal or something?
yeah, I don't know if this is the same place, but I know there was a place on the line where when they were on their way to Port Townsend, if they had decided they were going to eat there on the return trip, they would blow some kind of special whistle signal, and then the person at the eating house would get up and start thawing out steaks or whatever, and get things ready for when they came back.
So here that train is again at Discovery Junction. This is a very famous photograph by John Illman. Um, look at this with the train, beautiful day. What a shot. Quite something. Doesn't look quite the same these days.
Yeah, that's a classic shot there for sure on the big curve and everything.
And then here they are. This train is now proceeding towards Port Townsend. This is all on the same day. And here we're approaching Tukey's. In this picture with, what is this log sticking out of the ground do?
That's a gin pole, and that was used for loading or unloading logs off of cars.
Because it looks like there's a little siding there in the foreground right next to the locomotive. So maybe that's how
Yeah, they would spot the cars on that siding there, and I see a few logs laying off to the side over there. So they were either, I would say they're probably receiving logs here for the mill,
Hmm,
and this was how they unloaded them.
okay. Here's a couple of more shots. The narrative that we got from CRPA says that this is Nelson Landing. And I'm guessing they're going under Highway 20?
Yeah, it must be. Yeah.
Yeah. Classic shots. Look at that, coming and going. Wow. A little bit later, John had the opportunity in the diesel era to catch a train heading west at Maynard. Isn't
Wow.
there a little mill down there at Maynard?
Yep.
It'd ship once in a while, wouldn't it?
Mm-hmm.
What did they ship usually?
I think they shipped lumber out of there.
Yeah, okay. All right. Here's another picture of it, and there's that mill. This is Steve Hawk picture.
Yeah, the mill on the water.
Yeah, mill on the water. And then here we are at Port Townsend. And they're loading the barge. So what are these pilings that are kind of going off to the left in the foreground?
Oh, that's the remains of a Y. They had this barge landing used to be a big Y for turning the trains around, especially the passenger train would come up here. And there used to be a depot waiting room built off the side of the barge landing. And there was a boat from Seattle called the Sioux that would come here and meet the train and bring passengers over from Seattle and then take passengers to go back. And then the passenger train would then back out on the leg of the Y and up to Port Townsend proper and exchange passengers there. And then they were headed in the right direction to make the run back to Port Angeles.
Got it. And halfway between Port Townsend and Port Angeles, of course, is Squim.
And then just to add to that Y
Yeah.
thing, there was also the occasional car that would come over that needed to be turned because it was facing the wrong direction for unloading or something at an industry. And so they could use this Y to turn cars around too.
Well, gosh, Alan, actually, that does raise an interesting question because after this, obviously, this Y is gone by the 1970s. So where could you turn a car on the Olympic Peninsula?
I think you just had to be sure that they were loaded and turned the right way, and they put it on Seattle
Oh, okay.
and to
Okay.
take care of that in later years. But they because I'm not sure exactly why they abandoned that leg of the Y. My guess is that pilings just got bad and they just didn't want to spend the expense to replace them. So
Yeah. Well, moving along, here we are at Squim.
and there's that water tank for the
Yeah,
big.
there's that water tank. And now explain to us what what the signal next to the depot is for. What does that do? How does that work? And do you have any interesting stories about it?
Well, that was known as a train order semaphore, and
Okay.
the agent could also copy train orders that could be handed up to the train as it goes by to change a meet or notify the train of something that was concerning it. And so the semaphore blades could be put in. They're in the clear position right here in this picture.
Because they're more or less vertical.
Right. And so if they come down in a 45-degree angle, then that was for 19 form train orders that could be handed up on the fly. The train didn't have to stop to get them. if it was something that the train crew needed to know, right here at this spot, something that directly affected them, then the arms would be put in a stop position, which is horizontal position. And it wasn't very often that any train orders were put out at Squim. The railroad kind of was in a pattern of the same thing day after day. But they did have a rail detector over here one time, and the pilot conductor for the detector and the roadmaster were just walking alongside of it because it was moving so slowly. And when it got to Squim, the dispatcher realized that they were going to need more time in their orders to get to Port Townsend. So he put out an order to extend their time. And so the Squim agent put the order board out in a 19 position, and they went right by it. And about a block down the street, the roadmaster turned to the conductor and he says, "Aren't you curious about what that order is at the depot for you?" And he looked at that train order signal. He said, "I've been working on this railroad for 30 years and I've never seen that signal in a position." So he didn't even bother to look at it.
Hmm. And yeah, we'll come. Yeah, let's take some more. Take a little more of a tour of Squim. So here on the same day as this picture, we have another picture, except in this case in color, at the Squim Depot. And then here we see the Squim Depot in the late 1960s in one of your pictures.
Right.
Now they kind of changed it around by then a little bit, hadn't they?
Yeah, it's they uh they had modified the living quarters to also include where that bay window is, which was supposed to be the agent's office. And I guess now his office was out in the waiting room. And I know that a relief operator was working here. And of course, the agent and his wife had locked off the living quarters so that he wouldn't be in their personal things. And the dispatcher wanted to put a train order out, and the guy couldn't put the signal out because he was locked out of the office part where the control levers for that signal were.
Well, here's kind of a humorous note to the file about that whole situation. The agent said he was going to retire in 1944 during the height of the war. And they said that the agent's wife wanted to live in more comfortable quarters. So they said, well, if they did some repairs and some painting, that he would stay on the job indefinitely. I wish I could get employees like that these days.
Yeah, well, I find it funny too that they're suggesting that they just find some local contractor to come in and do the work, rather than use their own B&B department to do it.
No.
Whereas up in Sumas, the agent up there was doing remodeling in the office of the Sumas Depot, and he got a cease and desist order to stop working on the walls because that was B&B business, and he was crossing union lines there.
Yeah, those days have changed. So here again at Squim, Ray Barbieri, a longtime engineer, passes the depot in 1973.
Yeah, in one of the SD 7s, I think, or SD. No, that's an SD9.
SD9, yeah.
Which the Milwaukee, like I said before, they favored those consolidations on the branch lines in steam days, and the SD7s and SD9s were their choice for branch lines in after dieselization.
Here's another picture of it coming up on Priest Road, another picture from your collection.
Yeah.
And then another picture. This is actually the first Seattle and North Coast train, even though it looks like it's still a Milwaukee Road locomotive here at Morse Creek. Why did the Milwaukee like these big, long, locomotives? What were their
Oh, because they were 6-axle trucks, and they spread the weight out more evenly, because the Milwaukee branch lines, most of them were still using the original rail that they were laid with, which was 65-pound rail. And the SD7s and 9s were very forgiving on the light rail like that.
And
And
the
nickname
small
for
fuel
these,
tanks,
the nickname for it, the SD7s on the Milwaukee Road was stump pullers.
the what?
Stump pullers.
Dump pullers?
Yeah, because
Dump pullers.
they pulled so good. They had
Oh, yeah.
a lot of tractive effort. Whereas on
Tractive effort, low speed.
the Southern Pacific, they called them Cadillacs because they
Oh,
rode so well.
so here we're one of your pictures out working at Carlsberg.
Yeah, I think this one they might be out picking up scrap to sell to get fuel money. Because I think I have another picture in this series, and it looks like they're loading up rail.
Yeah, it looks like there used to be a siding right where the end of the locomotive is, and
Yeah, and towards after the bankruptcy in '77, Milwaukee started pulling up sidings and passing tracks that they weren't using anymore, and selling that rail off to get money to buy fuel because they got into a point where the fuel companies would only accept cash for the fuel.
oh. Here we got a Steve Hoff picture of the train just coming up on Agnew late in the day. It's kind of a pretty picture out there in the country.
Yeah,
It's nice
and
country
lucky to
out
get a
there.
picture of it in the daytime.
What's that?
And lucky to get a picture of it in the daytime.
Yeah, right, because it was normally a night operation. And here's a John Illman picture from the mid 1950s of the train out in that same kind of part of the world. Look at that beautiful scenery.
Wow.
Isn't that something? So then the change came, as we were kind of alluding to, in the early 1950s when steam went away and diesels came in. And now the picture on the left of the diesels, what's going on there?
Okay, that's the first diesel engine to arrive over there when they started to phase out the steam operations. And it was in, I think, the early part of December of '53 when they received that engine. And you have Oral Freeman, who we saw a picture of earlier, is still engineer on this line. And then on the left there, and then the guy on the right is Ed Nitre, who was a fireman at that time, but he became locomotive engineer later on.
How do you spell
And
Ed's last name?
Nitre, Nyitray.
Nyitray?
Yeah.
Okay, got it.
And this picture was in a newspaper article over there. And they were playing on the fact that it was December and that this shiny, nice, clean locomotive was their Christmas present. They wouldn't have to work on those dirty old steam engines anymore.
As we see in this 1953 picture on the right by John Yeoman of Port Angeles. Yeah, you can see that they like that 1200 class locomotive out there on the Olympic Peninsula.
Yeah.
So what do we got here?
This is an early picture of the town, overview of the town, and then the railroad out there in the bay, and you can see it's mostly on piling. There was just one long, huge pile trestle, and the depot itself was all built on piling too. And in later years, that was all filled in. You'd never know it was that way, but at the time, I guess you could go dig clams under the depot if you wanted to at low tide.
Low tide. So here's your map of now this covers all the eras, but we just want to see now the depot that we saw earlier on, that's about in here, right?
Right.
And then the scale tracks are down in here, and here's the pier. And then this is where they loaded the shingles.
Yeah.
What was the deal on that?
Well, M.R. Smith Shingle Company had a mill out at Beaver, which is way out near Lake Pleasant, west, considerably far west of Port Angeles. and no rail service out there. So they used to load all their shingles up on trucks, bring them here to Port Angeles, and load them down there on that spur. And the nice thing about them is that they preferred the little 40-foot ribside boxcars that the Milwaukee had quite a fleet of them, but most shippers didn't want them anymore. They wanted the newer 50-foot cars and the big wide doors and all that stuff. And so it was nice to have a use for those cars because they were easy to get. You didn't have to worry. You just tell the car distributor that you wanted 3 or 4 of them, and he could get them practically anywhere for you.
Okay. So then this is what the yard power that worked around Port Angeles looked like in the 70s.
Yeah, the SW1 there on the left was the normal assigned switch engine to Port Angeles. But when that engine had to go in for monthly repairs or inspections or whatever, then they would send out either an SW1200 or an NW2 bigger switcher engine out there to take its place.
Okay, in this case, the 665 is an NW2.
Yeah,
Yeah, so here's the 869 in action. It's out on the dock.
yeah, out of the Port Angeles docks, which was the original barge landing when the railroad was first building out here in 1914.
A lot of action going on here. I got logging trucks. They must be loading these logs onto these ships.
Yeah, they were exporting logs heavily out of there in
Yeah,
those days.
yeah, in those days, yeah.
Yeah, I remember,
Another one of the,
I
oh,
remember seeing ships at anchor further out in the bay, waiting their turn to come up to the dock to get logs.
mm, yeah. Another one of the industries was Peninsula Plywood.
Yeah, Penn ply.
Penn Ply. Now, did you guys do much business with them in the 70s?
Yeah, I think so. They were um, shipping out. They made a plywood that was used for siding on houses and stuff was one of their biggest products.
Here's a picture of the train kind of working the siding there. It looked like you pushed stuff into a shed to load it.
Yeah, they had tracks that went right inside the warehouse there
Okay,
alongside the loading docks, so you could load rain or shine.
there you go. And then once they're loaded, then what do you got to do?
Well, then you got to weigh them so you know how much to charge for shipping them.
So that's
So
what these guys are doing?
they had a little scale house down there on that same area, and the one guy in the white hat is probably out there flagging for any automobile traffic that might be coming across that road because when they get done weighing the cars, I think then they kick them across that crossing there.
Oh, okay. And now who all was all involved in weighing the cars? You got someone watching the crossing. It looks like you got someone in the scale house. Didn't the clerk have to come down there and help with this?
Yeah, the clerk from the depot, she came down and did the weighing, the actual weighing of the handling of the scales inside the scale shack. But the train crew handled the spotting of the cars and that stuff. I was never down to this scale shack, so I'm not sure how it was set up. But the one we had up at Cedar Falls, we had a bell on it, and when we were done weighing and ready for the next car, we'd hit the bell, and then they'd kick that one car off and spot another one for us.
So here's a little bit of a close-up of your map that kind of shows in detail this area and along with another picture of the scale house, and you look right down that track and then there's that dock.
Yeah, you can see the scale in front of the scale house. They have a double set of tracks.
Yeah, what's that about?
You have the live rails, which is what you spot the cars on to weigh them with. It
Okay.
activates the scale, the beam. And then you have the dead rails, which don't affect the beam. So you normally have that, if you're using that track for other things, then you line it for the dead rails so that you're not damaging the scale by running heavy locomotives and stuff over it.
Oh, that makes sense. So the ones on the left are the scale and the ones on the right are the dead tracks?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, okay. And then here we kind of see this is 1977, so right in your era, this is what the port looked like back in those days.
Yeah, busy place.
Yeah, there was a lot of industry there, wasn't it?
Yeah, we built out a lot of shipments out of that place, and it was mostly big money. It was long haul stuff that went back east.
Yeah, look at all those log floating logs out there in the pond.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's something. And then the cabooses that they had out here were kind of unusual.
Yeah, they had the drover cabooses that Milwaukee made. I don't know, about a 15 or 16, I think was about all they had of these. They built these steel cabooses and called them drover cabooses. And so the original intent was when they were hauling stock trains and stuff that the cattle companies would usually send some people along on the train to make sure the cattle were fed and watered properly and handled okay and all that stuff. And so these cabooses had little extra accommodations for the drovers. And in later years, these ended up out on some branch lines, and so there was like three of them out here out west. There was one on the Port Angeles line here. There was one up on the Bellingham line, and then there was one down at Bowville on the Washington, Idaho, and Montana Railroad, which was a subsidiary of the Milwaukee by that time.
And one of these actually has lived on. When I was out visiting in November, I took a picture of this in the parking lot of a sand and gravel operation in Squim. So still living on. So just a couple things, Alan, to just finish up. I just need to thank some people. We're almost done. John Illman, we were looking at his pictures today, and I want to specifically thank the Center for Railroad Photography and Art in Madison, Wisconsin, and a special thanks to Adrian Evans and Gilbert Taylor, who scanned all these images and made these images available for us. Most of this stuff has not been seen in, 30, 40 years. So it was very kind of them to help on this project. And Mr. Illman, like I say, is a local, so it's pretty cool. And you, Alan, have presented why don't you tell us a little bit about the lectures you've done for Historic Olympic Peninsula?
Uh, well, I tell about the what I did.
Oh, talking about, Alan has presented a series of lectures for Historic Olympic Peninsula.
Oh, you mean the articles I did for the
Yeah,
Facebook
just
page?
tell us a
Yeah.
little bit about them.
Yeah, there's a Facebook page called the Historic Olympic Peninsula. And so I joined them, and I decided that since I had so many old time photographs and so much information of the line out there, that I started doing a series of short articles with photos of the railroad operations over there on the peninsula. And it grew quite popular, and I made a few good friends out there and found out some more information that I didn't know myself. So that was kind of a cool experience.
Yeah, and I've listed the link on that thing. Nothing I ever use, a thing called Facebook, whatever that is. So for more information, folks, it's a place you can learn more about what Alan's got to share. At this point, we've reached the end of Alan's presentation. I want to thank everybody for being here. And if we've got any questions, we can take those now. Thanks again, everybody. We appreciate your being here.
Thank you, folks.
And